Every crime hides a story, and every story leaves a trace.
It was in the unseasonably chill dusk of an April evening in the year 1891 when I found myself once again seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes in the familiar and comforting confines of 221B Baker Street. A fog had crept in from the Thames, clinging to the windows with a damp insistence, while the occasional clatter of hoofbeats upon wet cobblestones below reminded us of the restless world continuing its motions just beyond our hearth. Holmes was in one of his more contemplative moods, reclining in the armchair with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling with such unyielding intensity that I dared not interrupt him. The coal fire cast flickering shadows across the room, throwing long, wavering silhouettes that seemed to pace in concert with Holmes's private thoughts. I had come prepared to speak of a peculiar case recently reported in the Pall Mall Gazette. A mysterious fire in Clerkenwell that had consumed the entire chapel of St. Agnes within the walls. But Holmes spoke first. "You are pondering the blaze in Clerkenwell, are you not, Watson?" he said, without shifting his gaze. I blinked, caught off guard as always by the uncanny sharpness of his deductions. "I am, Holmes, though I don't recall mentioning it." "You didn't. Your eyes lingered on the paragraph halfway down the third column of the Gazette folded beside you. Moreover, your umbrella is still speckled with soot. No doubt from visiting the ruins this morning. I dare say you found the air there most disagreeable." I smiled, shaking my head in quiet admiration. "You astound me. But yes, I did go to see it for myself. An odd thing, that fire. I heard a constable say there was something peculiar found in the debris." Holmes finally sat up, and with that movement came a spark of interest to his pale eyes. "Ah, then Inspector Lestrade is likely to arrive within the hour." "Indeed?" "You expect him?" "I do. Scotland Yard rarely stumbles upon curiosities they cannot explain without at least offering me the satisfaction of the challenge. And if what I surmise is true, Lestrade is no doubt bewildered by the bell." The bell. At that precise moment, as though fate had orchestrated the timing, a sharp rap sounded at the door below. A moment later, the familiar tread of Mrs. Hudson's feet ascended the stairs, followed by a brisk knock. Holmes had already risen. "Enter Lestrade," he called. The door opened, and in stepped Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, looking rather winded, a touch more grey at the temples and visibly out of sorts. He carried a small cloth-wrapped bundle in his gloved hands, and held it before him as one might present a relic to a priest. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson? I don't suppose either of you have taken a fancy to church bells lately." Holmes gestured toward the fireplace and offered Lestrade the chair closest to the warmth. "Sit, my dear fellow, and do tell us how the clergy have managed to lose one of their bells in a manner so urgent that it requires police intervention." Lestrade snorted, though without amusement. "There was a fire last night, as I'm sure you're aware. The chapel was gutted entirely. Only the stone walls remain. But what's left in the rubble?" He unwrapped the bundle with practiced care, revealing a small brass handbell, scorched black around the rim, but oddly intact otherwise. Watson and I leaned forward. The bell was elegant, the sort that might once have summoned a deacon or signaled the beginning of evening prayers. "The odd thing is," Lestrade said, lowering his voice, "it was found clutched in the hand of a corpse. A man. Unknown. Burned almost beyond recognition. But here's the rub. The bell was still ringing." "Still ringing?" I echoed. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "You mean to say it was sounding when they found it?" "Not a soul believes it, but that's what the vicar swears. Said he heard it tolling when he arrived. Now, it might have been the wind or the collapse of the belfry, but there's more. The chapel was supposed to be empty. It had been closed for repairs the last 3 days. No one should have been inside. And yet, someone was. Holmes took the bell into his long fingers, turning it over with a delicate precision. Burned, but not melted. Curious metallurgy. And this handle. Watson, do you note the carving? I examined it. Just beneath the soot lay a faintly engraved initial, a cursive E, entwined with a vine. Do you know who he was? I asked. Lestrade shook his head. No identification. Not a scrap of paper on him. We thought perhaps he was a vagrant or a squatter, but then why this? Why a bell? And why was he lying inside the altar chamber of all places? Holmes placed the bell carefully on the table and stood. Lestrade, you were wise to bring this to me. The chapel of St. Agnes has not rung a bell in years. Its tower was condemned, if I'm not mistaken, which means this one is a private artifact, possibly even personal. You'll come with me, then? Lestrade asked. Holmes reached for his coat. Indeed. Watson, your umbrella. We've a corpse who clung to a bell while the flames consumed him, and I intend to know why. A man who dies ringing fire into a sacred silence is either a martyr or a murderer. And with that, we stepped out into the mist-bound streets of London, the bell's echo faint in our ears, and a mystery already rising from the ashes. The fog thickened as we travelled by hansom toward Clerkenwell, curling around the lamps like pale fingers and muting the clatter of hooves into a ghostly echo. Holmes was silent for much of the ride, the bell now wrapped once more in its cloth and resting on his knee like an altar offering. He seemed to be listening, not to me or the world beyond the cab, but to some internal metronome ticking off thoughts as methodically as a metronome marks a musician's tempo. I find, he said at last, that a ringing bell is a declaration. It signals entrance, arrival, the commencement of a thing. But when it tolls during a fire, it ceases to be ceremonial. It becomes desperate. You believe the victim was trying to summon help? Perhaps. Or perhaps he wished to draw someone's attention, not to the fire, but to himself. Bells are not used in solitude, Watson. They are meant to be heard. Clerkenwell was less affected by the fog than the West End had been. The air here was tinged instead with the acrid scent of char. As we turned into the lane where the chapel of St. Agnes had once stood proud, a constable waved us through the barricade with a nod of recognition. The building itself was a blackened shell, its iron-laced windows shattered, its modest spire now a broken stump. Piles of scorched timber and crumbled masonry lay strewn like discarded bones. Yet the structure had not collapsed entirely. The altar chamber, built of older, sturdier stone, still stood dark and cavernous. We were met at the site by a man in clerical attire, his white collar smudged with soot and grief. He introduced himself as the Reverend Jonathan Larch. I'm afraid you've come to a tomb, he said. The soul who died in that fire, it was no parishioner. None of us knew him, and yet he perished right beneath the altar where we've offered morning mass for 40 years. Holmes extended a hand politely. Reverend, may I ask? You said you heard the bell. What precisely occurred? The Reverend looked toward the scorched entry. I arrived at dawn. The chapel was to be re-inspected for structural safety before reopening. I'd brought my keys, and as I approached, I thought I heard it. A small, metallic ringing. Once, twice. Not loud, but distinct. I assumed I was mistaken until I entered and saw the smoke. You went in? Not far, just to the threshold. I called out. There was no answer. Then flames erupted from the vestry, and I fled to fetch help. Holmes looked thoughtful. You said you brought keys. May I see them? Larch retrieved a modest ring from his coat pocket and handed it over. Holmes examined them under the gaslight affixed to the constable's booth. Curious, he murmured. This key here, it's scorched at the teeth. Larch frowned. That would be the vestry key. I attempted to unlock it. I remember fumbling. The heat was unbearable. I dropped the keys before I fled. Holmes handed them back without comment, and moved to inspect the altar chamber. Watson and I followed. Inside, the walls bore the marks of fire, but remained intact, ancient stone blistered but unyielding. A cracked wooden cross still hung above the altar, its Christ figure charred beyond recognition. On the floor, marked faintly in chalk by the yard's forensic man, was the outline of the victim's body. Curled slightly, one arm stretched outward where the bell had been found. Holmes crouched low, studying the markings. This was not a man overcome in flight. Look at the outline. He lay here, deliberately. The arm extended, not in pain, but offered. I frowned. You think he placed himself there on purpose? Or was placed, Holmes said quietly. He stood and examined the walls behind the altar. Then, to my surprise, he tapped gently along the paneling, listening. A soft thunk rewarded his effort. Watson, your assistance. With some effort, we helped Holmes pry loose a loose stone near the floor behind the altar. Within, wrapped in oilskin, was a thick ledger, remarkably untouched by the fire. Holmes pulled it free and opened it. His brow lifted slightly. Ah, he said, leafing through it. Curious indeed. He turned it to us. The pages were lined with names, dates, and monetary amounts, but it was not a donation log. Each entry bore initials rather than names, and the dates matched no particular calendar or liturgical observance, and every 10th page bore the emblem of a small bell, stamped in faded red ink. What do you make of it? I asked. A ledger of transactions, undoubtedly, but not of any ecclesiastical kind. Reverend, he called, returning to Larch, is this chapel associated with any charitable institution? Larch looked hesitant. We provide space for certain discreet ministries, refuge for the poor, services for the blind, and there have been private donations, often anonymously given. Why do you ask? Holmes gave a slight nod, then closed the ledger. Because this chapel, I believe, has served as a front for something far less sacred. Lestrade, who had just rejoined us with his boots muddied from walking the perimeter, snorted. A criminal operation? You think they were laundering money through the church? Holmes didn't smile. Not laundering. Storing. The bell may not have summoned salvation. It may have summoned an accomplice, or a rival. I suspect our victim was no mere squatter. He came here to rendezvous, possibly to make a transaction, possibly to destroy evidence. Watson looked down at the scorched outline of the body, and he failed. Holmes looked once more toward the broken belfry above. Or succeeded, at great cost. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I require 2 things. First, an analysis of the ledger's ink and paper. Determine where it was printed and when. Second, I need the coroner's full report on the victim. Every trace, however small. There's more to this than an accidental fire. This was a signal and a silencing. And where will you be, Holmes? Lestrade asked. Holmes pocketed the bell carefully. Visiting an old acquaintance, a certain Miss Euphemia Vole, formerly a choir mistress here, and, more recently, the proprietor of an establishment in Spitalfields known as the 10th Bell. I believe she may hold the key to our burning question, why does a man ring a bell while dying in fire? And with that, Holmes vanished once more into the fog, a ghost chasing the sound of secrets. The hansom cab rattled eastward, carrying us through narrower, rougher streets as we left the burnt skeleton of St. Agnes behind. The further we travelled into Spitalfields, the more the genteel charm of the West End gave way to the weary resilience of London's underbelly. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly above cobbles, slick with recent rain, and the smell of coal smoke mingled with damp cloth and rotting produce from the nearby market stalls. Holmes sat rigid beside me, his coat collar turned high against the cold, his sharp eyes scanning the street signs as though each bore a cipher only he could read. The 10th bell, he murmured at last. It was once a bawdy nickname given to a missing bell at St. Dymphna's. Reputed to ring only when death approached a parishioner, Euphemia Vole chose her name with a certain theatrical flair. "And who is this Miss Vole?" I asked, glancing warily at a man asleep against a lamp-post, a bottle clutched to his chest. "She is not unlike many of the capital's minor enigmas, Watson. A woman of contradictions. Once a gifted chorister, later a blackmailer's courier, and more recently a self-declared patroness of the forgotten. She runs her establishment as a house of sanctuary of sorts. Though what exactly is being sanctified is an open question." The cab drew to a halt outside a narrow 3-story building wedged between a shuttered tobacconist's and a boarded-up pawnshop. The gaslight above its doorway cast a faint, steady glow upon a faded sign bearing a painted bell, crimson and cracked. No bell sounded as Holmes knocked 3 times with the curved head of his cane. After a pause, a small pane in the door slid open, revealing a pair of watchful eyes. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Holmes said plainly. The slot snapped shut. We waited. Then, slowly, the door opened, revealing a tall young man with a crooked nose and a silver-tipped walking stick. He stepped aside without a word. We entered into a low-ceilinged parlor, dimly lit and thick with the scent of incense and pipe smoke. The furnishings were mismatched. An elegant chaise beside a threadbare divan, framed hymns on one wall opposite a lurid oil painting of the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia. The hush was palpable, like the moment before a hymn begins. Miss Euphemia Vole awaited us in the next room. She was seated upright behind a desk littered with correspondence. Tall, narrow of face, and draped in a dark plum gown, she looked more like the matron of a private hospital than a figure of the underworld. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, flicked from Holmes to me and back again, their sharpness undiminished by years of whispered infamy. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice composed but wary. "It has been many years, and yet your knock still carries the same tempo. 3 deliberate beats, each as precise as a choir master's baton. To what do I owe the return of London's least obedient son?" Holmes offered a courteous nod. "To fire, Miss Vole. Specifically, the one that consumed the chapel of St. Agnes. A man died within it, clutching a bell. A curious bell, elegant, brass, engraved with an E." She did not blink. "Then you've come about Edmund." Watson and I exchanged a glance, but Holmes's expression remained unchanged. "You knew him." "I knew of him, Edmund Teale. He was once a choral scholar at St. Agnes, until the roof collapsed in '85 and the choir was disbanded. Since then he became entangled in arrangements not dissimilar to my own. He worked under the table, in shadows, dealing in papers, signatures, whispers. Blackmail." She smiled thinly. "Whispers, Mr. Holmes. They are often more valuable than threats." Holmes stepped closer to the desk. "This ledger, the one hidden beneath the altar, I suspect Edmund was its custodian." Miss Vole's gaze flickered. "Then he is most certainly dead." "The bell, Miss Vole." "Yes," she said softly. "The bell. He carried it always. Not as a weapon or a tool, but a mark. His seal, if you will. He rang it once during a clandestine exchange, and it became his signature. Those who heard it knew a deal was struck." "A strange symbol," I muttered. Holmes nodded. "And a potent one. A sound amid silence. A transaction's toll." Miss Vole opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, sealed with red wax. She held it out to Holmes. "I was told to give this to you should anything happen to Edmund. I do not know what's within." Holmes accepted it without hesitation and opened the seal. Inside was a short letter written in a tight, angular hand. "Holmes, if this reaches you, I'm already ash. The fire was inevitable. I uncovered something I should not have. There is no money in the ledger. Not truly. The figures are codes, dates. The bell marks the end of a 10 cycle. 1 cycle, 10 names, 1 bell. Someone is closing the books permanently. The next bell rings in Belgravia. E.T. Closing the books, Holmes repeated. The 10th name. The 10th bell. Watson, how many red stamps were there in the ledger? Every 10th page bore the bell. I counted 6 such pages. That would mean 60 names. 60 cycles, Holmes said, or 60 marks. Miss Vole, do you know of any ties between Teal and Belgravia? She frowned. None directly. But I do know that the man funding the restoration of St. Agnes resides there. Sir Lionel Ventmere. Reclusive, eccentric, but lavish with his donations. Did Teal ever mention him? Number but Teal once spoke of someone he called the Bellkeeper, a figure who never met face to face but issued instructions, payments, and threats, all under the symbol of the bell. Holmes turned toward the door. Thank you, Miss Vole. You have preserved not just a name, but a connection, and I suspect the next step in a pattern of calculated extinguishments. Outside, the air had turned colder, and the fog swirled more thickly around the lamps. Belgravia, I said. What might we find there? Holmes walked briskly toward the corner where a cab waited. A bell that has not yet rung, Watson, and if we are fortunate, a man who fears the sound of it. The fog had begun to lift as we arrived in Belgravia, though the sky remained oppressively grey, as if reluctant to reveal too much. The streets here were broad and clean, the houses tall and immaculate, with railings gleaming under the care of unseen housemaids. There was a stillness about the district, a calm so precise it seemed choreographed, and in that silence, Holmes's every footstep rang with purpose. Sir Lionel Ventmere's townhouse stood near the western edge of Eaton Square, a grand building of white stucco and iron balconies, its windows shuttered though the hour was just past noon. Holmes noted the detail without remark as he rang the bell, the one at the door, not clutched by the dead. After a long pause, a butler answered. Elderly, liver-spotted, and clad in a perfectly pressed uniform, the man's expression was unreadable, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Holmes. "We are not receiving callers," he said, his voice brittle. "Be so good as to inform Sir Lionel that Mr. Sherlock Holmes requires a word," Holmes said, stepping forward just enough to suggest it would be inconvenient to argue. The butler hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Wait in the library. I shall inquire." We were shown into a richly appointed room panelled in walnut, with a fireplace already lit, and the unmistakable smell of recent tobacco lingering in the air. Holmes walked its perimeter slowly, eyes flicking over the contents of the shelves. I noted rows of theology texts interspersed with obscure economic treatises. A strange coupling. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. 2 volumes on numerology, 1 on ecclesiastical architecture, and yet not a single work of fiction. "What does it suggest?" I asked. "A mind preoccupied with pattern and power, yet devoid of imagination." Moments later, the door opened, and a tall, gaunt man entered. Sir Lionel Ventmere was of indeterminate age, but something in his eyes, pale, deeply set, bespoke a weariness not born of years, but of burden. He wore a smoking jacket of heavy velvet and leaned on a cane tipped in ivory. Behind him trailed a scent of bergamot and old stone. "I had hoped never to meet you, Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble, "which I suppose means your visit is most unwelcome." Holmes bowed slightly. "And yet necessary. I'm investigating the death of a man named Edmund Teal, who perished in a fire at St. Agnes within the walls. He left a note that led me here." Ventmere moved to the fire, but he did not sit. He stared into the flames. "St. Agnes. I knew that place would bring ruin eventually, but not so soon. You funded the restoration." "I did." for reasons of inheritance and obligation. My grandfather was vicar there during the cholera years. I meant only to repair what was crumbling. And yet, Holmes said gently, something more than plaster was being preserved. A ledger was found beneath the altar, a ledger marked with bells. At that, Ventmere turned. His expression did not shift, but his fingers tightened on the head of his cane. "You found that ledger?" Holmes said nothing. "I see," Ventmere said. "Then we are much nearer the end than I feared." He walked to a sideboard and poured himself a measure of dark sherry. "You are not a man of the cloth, Mr. Holmes, nor of government, so I shall not insult you with obfuscation. Yes, I knew of the ledger. It was begun before my time, maintained through a chain of intermediaries. Men like Teal, women like Vole. I never met them, but I know what they did." "Describe it," Holmes said, his tone neutral. "A system of silence," Ventmere said simply. "A list of those whose public virtue did not match their private vice. Judges, politicians, clergy, even royalty. 10 names per cycle. Once 10 were gathered, the bell was stamped, a marker of completion." "And what was done with this information?" "Held. Used when needed. Destroyed if it threatened the structure. It was not extortion, Mr. Holmes. It was containment. Without it, much of London's order would collapse." "A rather charitable interpretation of systemic blackmail," I said before I could stop myself. Ventmere looked at me. "You're a doctor. Tell me, do you always inform your patients of every hopeless diagnosis? Or do you sometimes withhold knowledge for the greater comfort?" I said nothing. Holmes stepped closer to the window, where a patch of soot on the sill caught his eye. "But someone," he said, "has decided to end the cycles, to destroy the list and those who carry it." Ventmere nodded slowly. "There is a faction, a more radical arm of the old order. They believe the age of concealment must end, that the next cycle should be the last. I suspect Teal was their messenger, or their target." "Do you know who this faction serves?" Ventmere hesitated. "Number, but I know this. The next name on the list was to be revealed at an upcoming gathering, a private recital at St. Dymphna's school. A closed event, one of the Red Bell ceremonies. The final name was to be spoken aloud. That was the agreement. When is this gathering?" Ventmere drew in a sharp breath. "Tonight." Holmes spun to face him fully. "Then you must not attend." Ventmere smiled bitterly. "I'm not the guest of honor. I am the host." Without another word, Holmes turned to leave. I followed as we made our way swiftly back through the house and into the waiting air. The fog had cleared entirely now, and a sharpness had returned to Holmes's movements, the kind I'd seen only on the eve of danger. "We must reach St. Dymphna's before the ceremony begins," he said. "But what is this ceremony? What is it meant to accomplish?" Holmes hailed a cab, his fingers trembling with urgency as he opened the door. "A recital of names, Watson, a revelation masquerading as a concert. The final bell is meant to ring tonight, and if it does, it will not toll for the guilty alone. It will be the prelude to collapse." He climbed in, eyes fixed ahead. The fire at St. Agnes was only the beginning. Tonight, someone intends to burn reputations, not buildings, and we must stop them before the next bell tolls. The cab careened through the lamp-lit veins of the city as the day slipped toward dusk, the wheels hissing over damp stones. Holmes leaned forward, fingers laced, his expression more intense than I had seen in weeks. His eyes, though still and unblinking, seemed to trace patterns only he could see, a mental chessboard upon which each figure from our investigation moved with precise consequence. "St. Dymphna's," he said at last, "is no longer just a school for musical refinement. Tonight it becomes a theater of revelation. Someone, perhaps the very one who orchestrated Teal's death, intends to let slip a truth that has thus far only ever been implied through shadow and suggestion. "You believe this ceremony is a trap?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said, "that whoever now wields the ledger seeks to close its final page publicly. By naming the 10th mark aloud, they not only burn the ledger's contents, they force the cycle to collapse under scrutiny. We must act before the bell is rung again." As we arrived outside the gates of St. Dymphna's School for Girls, the sun's last blush dipped behind the rooftops, leaving the windows aglow with lamplight and activity. The chapel adjoining the school, a structure of arched stone and ivy, was already echoing with the restrained tuning of strings and whispers of a gathering audience. A red-robed porter stood near the gate, checking names against a guest list. Holmes approached with casual confidence, producing a small silver badge from his coat, a relic of a case long past involving forged musical manuscripts and a fraudulent earl. "Mr. Seiger von Kessel and companion," he said, adopting the crisp German accent that had once deceived half the diplomatic attachés in Mayfair. The porter, flustered by the flourish and the air of authority Holmes so easily exuded, scanned the list, failed to find the name, and promptly waved us through. The chapel's interior was hushed and golden with candlelight. A modest stage had been arranged before the altar, where a string quartet was adjusting their instruments. The pews, arranged in tight ranks, were already half filled with an eclectic assembly. Judges in civilian attire, veiled society women, a pair of bishops, and men with parliamentary profiles. Each face was composed but alert, as if everyone in attendance knew they were part of something clandestine, if not yet dangerous. Holmes tugged me toward a side aisle, scanning the nave with meticulous care. His gaze settled on a figure in the second row, Sir Lionel Ventmere, seated upright, his cane resting across his knees. He did not glance our way. "What is the plan?" I whispered. "Observe. Listen. Identify the speaker who will ring the final bell. Teal's letter mentioned someone closing the cycle, someone known only by symbol until now. That figure will reveal themselves tonight. We must be prepared to act before the final name is uttered." The lights dimmed. A woman stepped forward to the front of the stage, a poised figure clad in deep violet, a thin gold chain glimmering at her throat. I recognized her at once. Euphemia Vole. Her presence here, after all that had passed, was no coincidence. She addressed the audience with elegant formality. "Esteemed guests," she began, her voice perfectly pitched, "you have been summoned, not to music, but to meaning. Tonight is the final cadence of a long and silent symphony, one written in compromise, secrecy, and consequence. You who sit here are either complicit or marked." A rustle passed through the crowd, a sharp inhalation from somewhere near the rear. She lifted a hand. "We do not name names lightly, but we begin, as tradition demands, with the ringing of the 9th bell." From within the folds of her gown, she withdrew a small, familiar brass handbell. The light caught the engraved E upon its stem as she raised it. Holmes moved. He slipped from our pew and advanced swiftly up the central aisle, not drawing attention, but not hesitating either. I rose to follow just as Euphemia rang the bell. Its sound, clear and uncanny, shimmered through the chapel like a dagger through silk. At that moment, a second figure stood from the shadows near the choir stalls, a young man in a dark suit, face pale, hands trembling. I recognized him not from our inquiries, but from the ledger. I'd seen his initials, T.H., on one of the final pages. "Stop!" Holmes called out, reaching the edge of the stage. The young man froze. Euphemia turned, alarm flickering in her eyes. Holmes addressed the crowd. "This is not a recital. It is a purge. The names recorded in that ledger, each of them followed by a bell, have been compiled, not to be blackmailed, but to be destroyed." The audience stirred, several rising from their seats. Holmes gestured toward the young man. "This is Thomas Havelock, a former clerk at the Inner Temple, dismissed under sealed circumstances. His name was the 10th in the final cycle. He has been summoned here tonight as a sacrifice. Gasps rippled outward. Havelock stammered. I didn't know, she said. I'd be protected. Euphemia's voice sliced through the murmur. He was a danger. He broke the code. He sold a page of the ledger to the press. Holmes turned to her. And you intended to silence him as you did Teal. She stiffened. Teal was a liability. He tried to burn the ledger but hesitated. The fire cost him his life. I only finished what he began. At that, Lestrade emerged from the rear of the chapel with 2 constables in plain clothes, moving swiftly at Holmes's earlier summons. Holmes had dispatched them from Belgravia with instructions before we ever stepped into the cab. Euphemia Vole, Lestrade said grimly, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, obstruction of justice, and the unlawful concealment of state-sensitive documents. Vole said nothing. Her gaze flicked once toward Ventnor, who had not moved from his seat. Then she lowered the bell to her side, unresisting, as the constables took her by the arms. Holmes turned to the audience. This gathering is concluded. No names will be named tonight. The guests rose, murmuring, some pale, others red with embarrassment or rage. Sir Lionel stood at last, met Holmes's gaze, and offered the slightest of nods before departing without a word. Later, as we walked back through the chapel's courtyard, Holmes turned to me, the bell now in his pocket once again. There is a reason bells are rung at funerals, he said. They announce not the death of the body, but of a time, a silence, a secret. Tonight, Watson, we buried a very old secret. And if the ledger still exists, let it remain sealed. Truth, like sound, travels, often faster than we expect, but it should never be forced. A bell that tolls prematurely can bring down more than a chapel. He paused, watching the lights of the city shimmer beyond the gate. And sometimes, he added softly, silence is not cowardice, but mercy. We said no more that evening. The fog returned, but the bells at last were still. The following morning found us once again at 221B Baker Street, the rising sun washing the sitting room in a pallid gold that did little to ease the weariness in my limbs. Holmes sat cross-legged on the settee, the bell placed before him like a relic upon a shrine, its dulled brass surface catching the light just enough to remind one of its role in the evening's strange symphony. Lestrade had taken Euphemia Vole into custody without incident, and young Thomas Havelock was escorted away under protective supervision. Yet despite the successful intervention, Holmes seemed more contemplative than triumphant. His pipe sat untouched on the mantel, and his violin, so often a companion to restless thought, remained nestled in its case. "You're troubled," I said, breaking the silence. "Not troubled, Watson," he replied. "Curious." He rose and crossed to the writing desk, where the ledger, recovered from beneath the altar of St. Agnes, lay, sealed in a waxed envelope. With a flick of his finger, he opened it and began thumbing through the pages again. "You still suspect we've missed something?" I asked. "Not something, Watson. Someone." He paused on the final stamped page and tapped it. "Ventnor. He gave us the information we needed. He warned us about the ceremony." "Indeed. And yet I believe he has played a far more delicate game than he let on. Consider, he claimed to be a reluctant patron of the church, bound by legacy. Yet he was host to a ceremony designed to obliterate that very legacy. If he feared exposure, why did he not flee or object?" I thought for a moment. Perhaps he felt complicit, or perhaps he was too weary to fight the tide. Holmes shook his head. "Too neat. Too passive. No, I suspect Ventnor's role is more active than we were led to believe." He returned to the settee and leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Euphemia Vole was a formidable orchestrator, but she was also a messenger. The ledger's cycles, 10 names, 10 bells, were a construct, but someone had to decide which names were included. Someone sat at the center of the web. And you believe that was Ventmere? I believe he was either the originator or the inheritor, and I believe he's not finished. Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small envelope on a silver tray. "From Belgravia, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone cautious. "A man in livery delivered it. He would not give his name." Holmes took the envelope, opened it, and read in silence. Then he handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you are correct in assuming that not all bells toll in the open. Last night's interruption was expected. Euphemia played her part, so did young Havelock, and so, I suspect, did I. But there are other bells still hanging, and other voices yet to ring them. If you are determined to trace the origin of the ledger, you must begin not with those who carried it, but with those who profited from it. There is an address below. The house is no longer occupied, but it once held a man whose shadow remains within every page of that book. If you wish to understand the ledger's true purpose, begin there." LV, beneath the signature, was a scrawled address in Marylebone, 13 Stanningford Row. Holmes stood without a word, slipping the bell back into his coat pocket and fetching his hat from the stand. "Come, Watson. The true architecture of this affair lies not in who rang the bells, but in who forged them. If this address reveals what I suspect it may, we'll need clear minds and sharper eyes than ever." It was not a long journey. The cab dropped us outside a shuttered townhome with ivy-covered stonework and cracked shutters. Though modest by Belgravia's standards, it had once belonged to someone of means. Holmes approached the door and examined the lock. "Old," he murmured, "but recently disturbed. Someone's been inside, perhaps just this morning." With practiced ease, Holmes produced his pick and had the door open in under half a minute. The interior smelled of old paper and disuse. Dust clung to the air in silent drifts, and the floor creaked beneath our steps. We moved through a short hall and into what appeared to be a study, long abandoned but strangely orderly. A globe stood in one corner beside a leather chair. Shelves lined with legal volumes filled 2 walls. A portrait above the mantelpiece caught my eye. A stern-faced man with a preacher's mouth and a financier's eyes. Holmes approached a glass cabinet beneath the window. Inside were objects carefully arranged: a quill, a set of brass weights, a small stamp marked with a bell emblem. "This was the source," Holmes said softly. "Not just the records, but the system itself." He turned to the writing desk and pulled open the central drawer. Inside, bound in twine and yellowed with age, was a packet of letters addressed to a name I recognized from the ledger, D.K. Rowntree, a man whose entry had been circled in red, but whose fate had remained blank. Holmes opened the top letter and scanned it. "To Rowntree. The cycle proceeds as agreed. The names of the 3rd tier have been submitted. Teal will record them. Miss Vole will confirm. Payment for silence has been issued in full. Any attempt to publicize these figures will result in automatic inclusion in the next cycle. As always, the bell tolls for those who listen too closely." B. Holmes stared at the signature. B. Not Vole, not Ventmere. Another orchestrator, a silent partner. He folded the letter carefully. "Watson, Rowntree died in 1887, and yet these letters continued into 1890, which means the original architects of this scheme passed it on, trained successors. There's a deeper organization at work here. Not simply blackmailers, stewards of silence. They did not just seek power, they managed it." As Holmes replaced the packet, something rattled beneath the drawer. He removed it entirely, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single bronze key and a folded piece of parchment. Holmes read it aloud. "St. Ignatius Crypt, South Wall. Beneath the bell." He stood, his face as unreadable as the cipher we'd just uncovered. "We are descending, Watson. Beneath chapels, beneath ceremonies, beneath history. The ledger was only a curtain. Behind it lies the machinery of influence, and those who rang the bell may still be listening. I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the room. And this crypt, do you believe something's hidden there? I believe, Holmes said, replacing the key into his coat, that something was meant to be found, and someone, perhaps Ventmere himself, intends us to find it. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves along the path as the sky darkened overhead. The bells of Westminster rang faintly in the distance, innocent, routine. Yet their chime, so familiar, now felt like a summons. Holmes paused on the step, his gaze distant. "We are no longer solving a murder, Watson," he said quietly. "We are unburying a doctrine." And with that, we stepped into the deepening shadow, toward a crypt, a key, and whatever truth lay ringing beneath the bell. The late afternoon light was paling when Holmes and I found ourselves standing before the venerable stone facade of St. Ignatius, a church whose solemn presence had long been swallowed by the more glittering edifices of modern London. The bells above rang out their familiar tones, but beneath the surface we sensed a deeper resonance, the echo of secrets long buried. Holmes drew the bronze key from his coat pocket, the metal cold and weighty in his palm. "The crypt lies beneath the south wall," he murmured, eyes narrowing against the gathering shadows. "We must proceed with caution. Whoever built this repository intended it as a sanctuary, not merely of the dead, but of truth." A narrow weathered door, set flush with the church's foundation, bore a rusted iron lock that the key fit with a reluctant click. The hinges groaned in protest as we pushed the door open, revealing a steep stone staircase descending into darkness. The scent of damp earth and aged stone filled the air. Holmes lit a lantern, its flickering glow revealing walls lined with carved niches and ancient inscriptions. We stepped carefully down the steps, the silence around us thick enough to smother any whispered breath. At the base of the stairwell, a heavy iron gate barred the way. Holmes inspected the lock. Again, the bronze key turned smoothly, and with a groan, the gate swung open, admitting us into a crypt lined with stone coffins and sealed vaults. Holmes moved deliberately to the south wall, where a bell-shaped indentation was carved into the stone. "The bell beneath which the ledger's deepest secrets are kept," he said quietly. Tracing the contours of the bell, Holmes discovered a concealed latch. With a gentle pull, a section of the wall slid aside, revealing a narrow chamber illuminated faintly by phosphorescent lichen clinging to the stone. Inside lay a small wooden chest bound with iron straps and locked by a complex mechanism. Holmes examined the lock, producing from his pocket a set of finely crafted tools. His hands worked with meticulous care, and in moments, a satisfying click echoed softly. He lifted the lid to reveal a collection of documents, parchments, ledgers, and bundles of letters, all tied with ribbons of varying colors. At the center, an ornate handbell lay nestled atop the pile, its surface engraved with intricate motifs of ivy and thorn. Holmes lifted the bell, examining its craftsmanship. "This," he said, "is the original bell-keeper's seal, the emblem of authority within the ledger's shadowy hierarchy." I bent to peruse the documents. One parchment, freshly inked, bore a list of names. Each crossed out except the last. Rowntree. Below it, a date not yet reached. Tomorrow's date. Holmes' expression darkened. "The cycle continues, Watson. The ledger's web tightens even as we speak. Someone else has inherited the role of arbiter." From the shadows emerged a faint sound, the shuffle of footsteps. Holmes tensed, but I was already moving toward the entrance. There, silhouetted against the faint glow from above, stood Sir Lionel Ventmere, cane in hand, her face pale but resolute. "You've found what was meant to remain hidden," he said, voice low. Holmes turned slowly. "Ventmere, you have more to tell us, I suspect." The man nodded. "I inherited the ledger, as you predicted. It was a burden I tried to cast off, but the machinery of silence is relentless. This crypt holds not only records, but the means of enforcement. The bell-keeper is more than a figurehead. It is a mantle passed down to maintain order. Order, Holmes repeated. Or control. Ventmir's gaze hardened. Sometimes they are indistinguishable. Without the ledger, London's elite would be exposed, chaos would ensue. I hoped the cycles would end peacefully, but others disagree. He gestured to the documents. The names marked for the next cycle are those who must be silenced or coerced. Rowntree was last to receive the summons. The date was set to ensure compliance. But your interference has disrupted the balance. Holmes stepped closer. And yet you did not alert the authorities when Teal was killed, nor when Vole was arrested. Ventmir's jaw clenched. Because I cannot allow the ledger to fall into the wrong hands. The public does not need to know how deep the rot runs. A sudden noise, a faint scuffling from behind a pillar, caught our attention. Lestrade appeared, flanked by 2 constables. "We came as fast as we could, Holmes," Lestrade said. "The chapel was under watch, but the moment you left, a figure slipped through the shadows." Holmes frowned. "Then we are not alone in this crypt." From the darkness emerged a young woman, face obscured beneath a hooded cloak. She stepped forward, revealing eyes bright and defiant. "I am Margaret Halloway," she said firmly, "daughter of one of those named in the ledger. I have come to end this cycle once and for all." Ventmir's face twisted in despair. "You do not understand what you tamper with." Margaret raised a hand, her voice unwavering. "I understand perfectly. The ledger is a chain that binds us all to silence and fear. I'm here to break it." Holmes regarded her quietly. "And how do you intend to do that?" Margaret produced a small satchel, from which she withdrew a vial filled with a dark liquid. "This," she said, "is an accelerant. I will destroy the ledger and all it represents." The air grew tense as Ventmir stepped forward. Cane raised. "You cannot," he warned. "If that ledger burns, so does the city's fragile peace." Holmes held up a hand. "Enough." He turned to Margaret. "Destruction is not the only path. There are those who would use chaos to their advantage. But knowledge wielded wisely may yet bring change without ruin." Margaret hesitated, then lowered the vial. Lestrade moved to secure the chest and the documents. Holmes sighed, the weight of the evening settling over him. "Watson," he said softly, "the bell has tolled once more. But tonight we have kept it from sounding too loudly." Outside, the city lights flickered, the murmur of London life a distant hymn against the silence of the crypt. And in that quiet, I realized the true mystery was not in the ledger itself, but in the power of secrets, and the courage it takes to let them ring or remain silent. As dawn crept over London's rooftops, casting a pale light through the curtains of 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat quietly by the window, the brass bell resting on the table before him like an unyielding sentinel. The events of the previous night lingered in the air, a mixture of tension, revelation, and an uneasy truce. I poured 2 cups of tea, placing one beside him, but he did not immediately take it. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the bell. "Holmes," I began gently, "the ledger, the crypt, the cycles, all point to a network far more complex than we first imagined. Yet, despite unmasking the ledger's custodians, the true power behind it remains elusive." He nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Indeed, Watson. The ledger is merely a tool, a symbol. The real question is, who controls the tool, who benefits when silence is maintained, and who profits when it is shattered?" Before I could respond, a sharp rap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes took it without a word and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the message swiftly. "An invitation," he murmured. handing the paper to me. From Sir Lionel Ventmere, a request to meet at his residence. The message is terse, but unmistakable. The ledger's end is near. There are matters we must discuss in confidence. Holmes folded the telegram, his fingers tightening around it. It seems Ventmere seeks dialogue. Whether to confess, negotiate, or manipulate, I cannot say, but I do not trust his motives entirely. I share your wariness, I replied. After all, he concealed much before. We must proceed with caution, Watson. This may be the final movement in a symphony that began decades ago. An hour later, we found ourselves at Ventmere's townhouse. The butler admitted us without delay, and soon the master of the house appeared, looking more wearied than ever, but steadier than the last time we saw him. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Ventmere greeted us. "Please sit. There is much to discuss." We settled in the library, its walls lined with books and papers, a sanctuary of order amidst the chaos outside. Ventmere gestured toward the hearth where a fire crackled quietly. "The ledger's legacy," he began, "was designed to maintain equilibrium within the social order. Each cycle was a balance of power, a ledger of secrets that ensured discretion. Yet that balance has been disturbed. The younger generation, represented by Miss Halloway and her ilk, seeks to dismantle it utterly." Holmes interjected, "They see the ledger as chains, you as a jailer." Ventmere's eyes narrowed. "Chains can imprison, but they also bind society together. Freedom without order breeds anarchy." "And what of those who suffered under this system?" I asked. "The blackmailed, the silenced, the lives destroyed." "They are regrettable casualties," Ventmere admitted. "But in the grand scheme, a necessary sacrifice." Holmes leaned forward. "And the fires, the threats, the deaths?" Ventmere's expression darkened. "Unfortunate, but unavoidable. The ledger's preservation demands hard choices." I looked at Holmes, searching his face for judgment or insight. Holmes sighed. "The ledger is a tool of control, wielded by those who fear exposure, but it also serves as a mirror, reflecting the very society that created it." Ventmere nodded. "Precisely." There was a silence, heavy with implication. "Mr. Holmes," Ventmere continued, "I am prepared to relinquish the ledger and all associated powers, but only if the transition is managed with care. Chaos would be the cost of abrupt change." Holmes regarded him keenly. "And what terms do you propose?" Ventmere produced a sealed envelope from his pocket and handed it over. Opening it, I found a detailed plan, a blueprint for dismantling the ledger's operations over time, accompanied by assurances of protection for those named and measures for public disclosure that would prevent mass panic. Holmes smiled faintly. A cautious hand guiding a fragile piece. Ventmere returned the smile, weary but resolute. "As always, Mr. Holmes, the final bell tolls for us all. It is our choice whether it heralds silence or a new beginning." We left the house with the weight of decisions pressing upon us. The ledger, once a symbol of dark control, might yet become a catalyst for transformation. Walking back to Baker Street, Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, this case has reminded me that truth is rarely absolute. It is a harmony of shadows and light, and sometimes the most profound revelations come not from unmasking villains, but from understanding the motives that bind them." I nodded, feeling the dawn of a new chapter, not only for London's secrets, but for the very nature of justice and mercy. And as the city stirred awake beneath the soft morning light, I knew that the bell, though silenced for now, would forever echo in the corridors of conscience. The days that followed were marked by a delicate dance of discretion and inquiry. Holmes and I found ourselves navigating a labyrinth not only of secret documents and whispered threats, but of shifting alliances and veiled intentions. Ventmere's plan to dismantle the ledger's influence unfolded with cautious precision, yet beneath the surface, Currents of resistance churned, those unwilling to relinquish the power that the ledger conferred. One evening, as the gas lamps flickered through the fog, Holmes summoned me to his rooms with an urgency that belied his usual composure. "Watson, the ledger's shadow lengthens still. Despite Ventmir's intentions, the past is not so easily laid to rest. There are those who seek to preserve the old order at any cost." He handed me a letter, its edges crisp and the ink freshly dried. The letter was unsigned, but bore a chilling warning. "The bell tolls not for the guilty alone. Beware those who would silence the heralds of change. The cycle turns anew." Our investigation led us to a discreet club in the West End, a meeting place for influential men whose faces were unfamiliar, yet whose names had appeared repeatedly in the ledger's pages. Here, whispered conversations and guarded glances spoke volumes. Holmes observed quietly as we mingled, noting the subtle signs of unease among the members. Suddenly, a man approached, a stout, middle-aged fellow with sharp eyes and a demeanor of measured authority. "You're Mr. Holmes?" he inquired in a low voice. "I represent those concerned that the ledger's destruction will invite chaos. There are things better left unsaid, gentlemen." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. But I believe there are also truths that must be faced. Perhaps we can find common ground." The man hesitated, then extended an invitation to a private meeting. Over the next several days, Holmes and I attended clandestine gatherings, piecing together a network that spanned the highest echelons of society. The ledger, it seemed, was but a symbol of a vast mechanism designed to maintain order through silence and mutual obligation. Yet the question remained: could such a system survive the reckoning that Margaret Halloway and others demanded? Our inquiry was abruptly interrupted one morning when Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, bearing grim news. Euphemia Vole had escaped custody. The official report suggested a lapse in security, but Holmes suspected something far more calculated. "Her escape is a signal," Holmes remarked. "The balance is tipping, Watson. We must act swiftly to prevent a descent into chaos." Pursuing leads, we tracked Vole to a secluded cottage near the Thames, where she awaited with resolve etched upon her features. "You think me a villain," she declared, "but I sought only to break a chain of silence that suffocated truth. The ledger is a cage." Holmes engaged her in discourse, probing the motivations behind her rebellion and the factions aligned against change. As dawn broke over London, the fragile truce between secrecy and revelation hung in the balance. The bell, once a harbinger of silence, now symbolized the possibility of a new order, one forged through courage, understanding, and the willingness to confront the shadows of power. And as Holmes and I prepared to face the final act of this complex drama, I reflected upon the nature of justice itself, a melody composed not only of right and wrong, but of the delicate harmonies between mercy and truth. The cool air of the early evening clung to Baker Street as Holmes and I sat by the fire, the embers casting flickering shadows upon the walls. The intricate web of secrets, allegiances, and betrayals that we had unwound over the past weeks weighed heavily on my mind. The ledger, once a mere curiosity, had revealed itself as the nexus of a vast and dangerous network, its tendrils reaching into the highest seats of power and the deepest shadows of the city. Holmes, as ever, remained focused and unyielding. "Watson," he said quietly, "the time has come to confront the architects of this silence. We have gathered our evidence, identified the factions, and witnessed the fractures within. Now, we must bring them into the light." A letter had arrived earlier that day, unsigned but unmistakably an invitation. It directed us to a discreet estate on the outskirts of London, where a conclave of influential figures would convene. The purpose was clear: a final reckoning over the fate of the ledger and all it represented. We set out under the cover of night, the city's fog swirling around us as the hansom carried us through winding lanes until the estate's wrought iron gates loomed ahead. A discreet knock summoned the butler, who admitted us with a curt nod. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. The drawing room was filled with men and women whose names I'd seen only in whispered rumors, and the ledger's pages, politicians, judges, clergy, and financiers, each bearing the weight of their secrets. Holmes stepped forward, addressing the assembly with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads. The ledger's legacy has preserved order through silence, but at what cost? The fires, the deaths, the betrayals. These are not signs of strength, but of a system in decay." A murmur rippled through the crowd. From the shadows, Ventmere emerged, his presence commanding yet burdened. "The ledger was never perfect," he admitted, "but it was necessary. To dismantle it recklessly is to invite chaos and ruin." Margaret Halloway stepped forward, her voice resolute. "And to preserve it is to perpetuate fear and oppression. It is time for transparency, for accountability." Holmes surveyed the room. "Neither destruction nor preservation alone will suffice. The ledger must evolve, become a record not of threats, but of truth." The debate was fierce but measured, the assembly grappling with the gravity of their choices. At last, a consensus emerged. The ledger would be disclosed gradually, with protections for those implicated, and support for victims. The cycle would end, but its lessons would endure. As dawn broke over London, the first steps toward this new order were taken. Holmes and I watched from the window of 221B as the city stirred awake, the bells in the distance ringing clear and true. Holmes turned to me, a rare softness in his eyes. "Watson, justice is not merely the punishment of wrongs, but the restoration of balance. Tonight, we have witnessed both destruction and renewal. The ledger's final bell has tolled, not for an ending, but for a beginning." And so, with the city embracing a fragile dawn, the mystery of the bell that rang in the fire found its resolution. Not in silence, but in the courage to confront the past and ring out a new truth. The weeks following that solemn assembly passed with a curious blend of cautious optimism and guarded tension. London, ever the restless city, seemed to breathe easier as the ledger's shadow receded, yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of power and secrecy still rippled with subtle menace. Holmes and I remained vigilant, mindful that even the most carefully wrought resolutions can unravel when least expected. One fog-laden morning, as I sat by the window tending to my journal, Holmes returned from an errand with a contemplative expression. He placed a folded newspaper upon the table and beckoned me over. "Read this, Watson," he said softly. I unfolded the paper and scanned the headline. "Sudden Death of Sir Lionel Ventmere. A Tragic End to a Tumultuous Legacy." The article detailed Ventmere's mysterious passing in his Belgravia home, the cause listed as a heart attack, though the coroner's report was pending. Holmes remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Ventmere's death, while officially natural, raises several questions. He was under no known physical duress, yet his passing was abrupt. I fear that the ledger's echoes have not yet fully faded. Intrigued and concerned, we resolved to visit Ventmere's residence, now under police guard as a matter of routine investigation." Lestrade greeted us, a shadow of weariness darkening his features. "There are whispers, Holmes," Lestrade confided. "Rumors of foul play, but no proof. The city's elite prefer discretion over scandal." Inside Ventmere's study, we observed the orderly clutter of a life burdened by secrets, papers, letters, and the remnants of a man who had borne the weight of unspoken truths. Yet Holmes's keen eye caught a detail overlooked by others, a small smear of dark residue near the hearth. "Here, Watson," Holmes said, producing a magnifying glass. This appears to be a trace of bell metal, copper alloy, perhaps from a small hand bell. Could it be evidence of a struggle? I asked. Possibly, or a symbolic gesture. Holmes's gaze darkened. The bell's toll is never silent. Further investigation uncovered a hidden compartment within Ventmir's desk, containing correspondence between Ventmir and an unknown correspondent signed simply as B. The letters hinted at plans to safeguard the ledger's secrets, even beyond Ventmir's demise. Holmes's brow furrowed. The cycle continues, Watson. There are still players in this game who seek to control the narrative, to dictate which secrets remain buried. Our inquiries soon led us to a discreet gentlemen's club in Pall Mall, where whispers of a clandestine meeting circulated. Holmes and I attended in disguise, blending among the murmurs and furtive glances. At the heart of the gathering was a figure who commanded attention, a man known only as Bartholomew Crane, reputed to be the ledger's current keeper. His demeanor was cold, calculating, and unyielding. Holmes confronted him directly. "Mr. Crane, the ledger's time has passed. Its age of secrecy has ended." Crane's eyes gleamed with steely resolve. "Mr. Holmes, the ledger is not merely a book. It is a safeguard against chaos. Without it, society would unravel." Holmes's voice was firm. "Yet it has cost lives, silenced voices, and perpetuated fear. The city demands transparency and justice." The tension in the room was palpable. Crane's retort was cut short as Lestrade and a contingent of officers entered, arresting Crane on charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruction of justice. As the ledger and its keepers were brought to public scrutiny, the city braced itself for the revelations to come. Holmes and I observed the unfolding events with a mixture of relief and solemnity, aware that justice is rarely a simple path, but rather a winding road marked by courage and compromise. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes mused quietly, "Watson, the bell that rang in the fire was but the first note of a much larger symphony. We have silenced one chord, but the music of truth and justice plays on." I nodded, grateful for Holmes's steady presence amid the turmoil. And so, the case of the bell that rang in the fire drew toward its close, not with a final toll, but with the hopeful echoes of a city learning to face its shadows and, perhaps, to heal. The morning mist still clung to the streets of London as Holmes and I made our way along Baker Street, the city stirring gradually beneath the pale light. The recent arrests and disclosures had begun to unsettle the established order, and the ripple effects were already felt in the highest circles and the lowest alleys alike. Yet, amidst the shifting tides, one question remained unanswered. What had truly set the ledger, and all who surrounded it, on its fatal course? Holmes, deep in thought, paused outside our lodgings and looked up at the grey sky. "Watson, a mystery such as this is never wholly concluded until every echo has been heard. The ledger was only the beginning. The origins and the ultimate motive behind its creation remain to be revealed." Before I could respond, a figure approached. A courier bearing a letter addressed to Holmes in a familiar, meticulous hand. Holmes broke the seal and read silently, the shadows crossing his face deepening. "An invitation," he said at last, "from one who claims knowledge of the ledger's genesis. They request a private meeting tonight at an abandoned bell tower on the outskirts of the city." My curiosity piqued. We prepared for what could be the final chapter in this labyrinthine case. As dusk fell, we arrived at the bell tower, its silhouette etched starkly against the darkening sky. The air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of rain. Inside, a lone figure awaited, a frail man with keen eyes and an aura of quiet authority. "I am Elias Hawthorne," he began, "once a cleric and scholar who witnessed the ledger's birth. It was conceived not to enslave, but to preserve, to shield society from its own fractures." Holmes listened intently as Hawthorne recounted a tale of desperation and pragmatism. In times of great turmoil, a secret record was maintained to manage truths too dangerous for the light, to protect the innocent and contain the guilty through mutual accountability. But power, Hawthorne warned, is a double-edged bell. What was meant to protect became a cage. The ledger grew beyond its purpose, corrupted by those who feared exposure more than justice. Holmes's voice was steady. And the fires, the deaths, the ledger's keepers who silenced dissent. Hawthorne sighed deeply. Tragic necessities in a flawed system, yet the ledger's true end lies in transformation, not destruction. It must evolve into transparency coupled with mercy. The meeting concluded with a fragile understanding and a promise to guide the transition away from shadows toward openness. Returning to Baker Street, Holmes reflected, "Watson, justice is not absolute, but a balance between truth and discretion, punishment and forgiveness." The bell that rang in the fire was a summons not only to uncover secrets, but to reconcile them. As London awoke to a new dawn, the city stood at the cusp of change. The ledger's last cycle had told, its echoes fading into a future shaped by courage and clarity. And in that quiet morning light, I knew that the mystery of the bell, the fire, and the ledger had finally found its resting place, not in silence, but in the enduring pursuit of justice tempered by humanity. The first rays of morning crept through the lace curtains of 221B Baker Street, casting delicate patterns upon the worn carpet and the familiar clutter of Holmes's quarters. The city beyond stirred to life, a restless metropolis eager to forget the shadows that had loomed so long over it. Yet within this modest room, the weight of the past weeks settled like a quiet fog, thick with unanswered questions and uneasy truth. Holmes sat in his favorite chair, pipe unlit, eyes fixed on the brass bell resting on the table before him. It had been the silent witness to a mystery far greater than any mere arson or murder, a mystery of power, secrecy, and the fragile human desire to control truth itself. I took my seat opposite him, the usual warmth of our companionship tempered by the gravity of our conclusions. "Holmes," I began, "we have uncovered many layers, each deeper and more complex than the last. Yet the ledger's purpose and the human cost it exacted remain the heart of the matter. How do you reconcile justice with such a shadowed legacy?" Holmes exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Justice, Watson, is rarely a perfect equation. It is a balance struck amid chaos and order, mercy and retribution. The ledger was conceived in fear and maintained through silence, but it has taught us that secrecy, no matter how well-intentioned, breeds its own ruin." He stood and approached the window, looking out upon the awakening streets. The fires at St. Agnes, the tolling bells, the cycles of names. Each was a symptom of a system strained beyond repair. The ledger's keepers believed themselves guardians, yet they became jailers. I nodded, recalling the faces of those we met, Ventmere, Vole, Halloway, and the elusive Crane, each bound by duty, fear, or conviction. Holmes turned back to me, eyes bright with conviction. "The true resolution lies not in vengeance, but in transformation. The ledger must give way to transparency, its shadows replaced by accountability. Only then can society heal." As if to underscore his words, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes broke the seal and read aloud, "Mr. Holmes, your efforts have not gone unnoticed. Parliament is convening a special inquiry into the ledger and related matters. The city demands answers, and you are summoned to testify." He folded the telegram carefully. "The city will hear the truth at last, Watson." I smiled. "And the bell that rang in the fire? What of it?" Holmes picked up the bell, its brass cool and weighty. "A symbol of endings and beginnings. It told to warn and to remind. Now it shall rest, until a new age demands its sound. As the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating London streets, I felt a quiet hope stir. The mystery was resolved, not by uncovering every secret, but by daring to confront the darkness and choose the light. Holmes and I prepared to face the days ahead, certain that while one chapter closed, another had only just begun. And so ended the case of the bell that rang in the fire, a tale of shadows and silence, of courage and consequence, forever echoing in the heart of a city that never truly sleeps.